Welcome. I'm Paul Merkley, co-founder of Seniors Junction, a company that has been formed to keep us all sharp and interested and engaged. And right now, we're offering courses in music appreciation and art appreciation. They're taught at approximately a university level. They are geared to our community of over 55 years old. This is a sample of the kind of thing we do. An actual class would be about an hour and a half, approximately an hour of music and teaching. And the other half hour would be questions and discussion. This is just going to be short, a little more than 10 minutes, but I think it will give you the flavor of what we do. And after looking at it, I hope you'll check us out further and maybe sign up for a class. So without further ado, I'm going to share screen. All right, first thing I'm going to do is play a musical excerpt. And if you were all here in a class, I'd ask you how many of you recognize this and what it is. But I'm going to guess that many of you already know. All right, so probably you know that this is by the composer Beethoven, and that this is the first movement, the beginning of the first movement of his Fifth Symphony. And then I'd ask you what you remember about Beethoven. And some of you might say, well, he composed while he was deaf. And that's true. This is the Fifth Symphony. He was already going deaf when he was working on his Third Symphony. By this time, he couldn't hear very well at all. His deafness was a terrible burden, but maybe not quite in the way that many people think. It was not an obstacle to his composing music, because a great composer like Beethoven can hear all the music in his mind as he writes it on the paper. So that was not the problem. The problem of deafness for him was personal, professional, and social. So in other words, he believed it would be difficult, and I'm sure he was right, to persuade, let's say, a patron to rent an orchestra and a hall for him to have one of his symphonies performed if that patron knew he was deaf. So he tried very hard to make sure that nobody in Vienna, where he was working, found out. I think that's the reason he put on the rough and gruff exterior personality that he cultivated, because I think it enabled him to have shorter conversations. People wanted him to leave the room because he was so difficult to get along with. So he could have a conversation and the patron could say, well, I talked with Beethoven briefly and we spoke about his concert, but you know how difficult a man he is to talk to. I was glad when he left. Versus, I talked with Beethoven for half an hour about a possible concert. I had the feeling at times in the conversation that he was hard of hearing. So Beethoven didn't want that. He didn't want anyone to know. And I think that's the reason he made himself disagreeable, let's say. All right. So let's talk a little bit about the piece and how it is put together. Having heard your comments, initial comments, I would go to a slide that tells you the terms of the day. There are two terms that I would like to define or discuss very briefly. One is tonality, and the other is motif. Tonality is the musical equivalent of the force of gravity. It draws music towards an endpoint. If you sing a national anthem and you stop at the second last note, you're going to want to sing the last note because that is where the tonality is pulling it. Oh, Canada, we stand on guard for thee. It begs to go to the last note because tonality is a force that draws it there. So other national anthems, this piece, none of them is an exception to that. This piece has a tonality, and the tonality pulls the music towards it. Motif is the other term I wanted to use. A motif is a musical fragment, very short, recognizable, can be repeated, especially can be repeated at different levels. So this one is just 4 notes. It's 3 notes the same and a little leap down. Da, 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 da. And what does he do right after that? Well, he does it again, just a notch down, and it fits in between. Da, 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 dum, da, 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 dum. So they're hooked together. And he keeps going, making a chain. Da, 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 dum, da, 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 dum. Then upside down, da 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 dum, right side up, da 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 dum, upside down, da 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 dum, da 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 dum, dum dum. Now you say for sure he is going to do something different. No, he's not. Da 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 dum, and on we go with the chain. And they're hooked together, I say, like Lego blocks. So it's like mosaic tiles, just fit together to make a bigger whole. Motif, we call it motivic writing. It's typical of the Romantic era. The Romantic era, I would say it started with Beethoven's Third Symphony in 1802. Now we're in 1805. Maybe the most famous motif in the world is the one that's just 2 notes long that John Williams wrote to signify the shark in Jaws. Da-dum, da-dum. Sing those 2 notes practically anywhere in the world, and someone's going to say, that's the shark from Jaws. They might even start to move their hand like the fin of the shark. So, out of these little motifs, he crafted a very large piece of music. Now, Beethoven's working method was very different from Mozart's working method. Mozart composed longer strands of music at a time, wrote whole phrases in repeatable forms. Let's say, for instance, a question and answer form, but not little tiny motifs. So for this reason, Mozart was able to compose more fluently. Probably when we read the stories that he wrote a whole movement while he was taking a ride on a stagecoach, it's probably true, because once he had an idea, he could draft it out in big, long phrases that turned into a whole movement. For Beethoven, it was a different process. So as a result, when we look at Mozart's writing, he doesn't have sketches, he has autographs, and the autographs have hardly a change on the page. He wrote it out in a fair copy right away. Beethoven, well, that is not the case. Beethoven's sketchbooks are pretty messy. So here we are. Look, for example, at the 4th last line here in the center. That's a lot of crossing out. That's a lot of, we say, corrective content, a lot of correction, a lot of revision. Places like this. revision, changes. You can also see that there are different pieces being worked on and different short sessions, right? Like if you look at the slant of the notes, you can see these are slanted, and that means probably that they were worked on not at the piano, but at a little side table that he kept for that purpose. Versus when we look down, let's say at the 5th and 6th lines, it's straight up and down, which suggests that these were composed at the piano. Not too much composed at the time. Again, the fluency is not associated with this motivic technique. If you're going to use motifs, you're not going to be able to be as fluent because you have to work them out. I would say that this particular page of the sketchbook probably has little bits of 6 pieces written on it. And indeed, if we look at whole symphony movements, we see the motif scattered over many pages. So having to work with motifs, that's one reason that Beethoven had a different process than Mozart. I would also say that he had what I would call creative blocks. He had a terrible childhood. His father threw him down the stairs many times and he hit his head. His father also woke him up in the middle of the night to entertain drinking buddies. So he had nothing kind to say about his father for sure. I don't know if being thrown on his head affected his hearing later in life, but I think if I can ask the question, he might have asked the question. He might have said, am I even deaf because of the abuse from my father? So, not surprisingly, he had some trauma there and some creative blocks. Some of the simplest little melodies he struggled with very much over the years. And we have an example of a simple little song he was writing, and we find it spread over 7 sketchbooks and 8 years of work, which shouldn't have been. Mozart would never have taken that time with it. Well, this gives you some idea about Beethoven, some idea of the sorts of things we do. I would have heard your comments, I would have taken your questions at different points, and this would have gone on longer. We would have looked at other pieces by Beethoven and talked about them. I would love to talk with you about music. I would love to talk about your impressions and reactions and how you understand it. I would enjoy that very much. So I'll simply say, if you found this interesting, please check us out, www.seniorsjunction.com, and sign up for our newsletter. And I'm going to wish you happy listening and invite you to come back and hope that you do so. Thanks very much for coming.